Well, I first got into journalism actually in high school when I started writing satire pieces that were modeled after Art Buchwald. And my English teacher at the time read them and said, hey, you ought to consider going into journalism. And so I did. I eventually became editor of my high school newspaper, which really taught me a lot about how to lead a team. And then I went to Stanford and I started an Asian American newspaper, of which the famous or the infamous Lori Matsukawa in Seattle was managing editor. And after that, they felt sorry for me, so they gave me an internship at the LA Times in the business section. And even after the internship, they felt even more sorry for me, so they offered me a job. So I went straight to the LA Times, and that's the only place I ever worked professionally as a journalist.
So you're at the LA Times. What was journalism like back then, and what was the year?
Well, I joined the LA Times in 1979, and there were very few Asian Pacific journalists there at the time. David Kishiyama and Nancy Yoshihara were two who were, and they were my two first contacts there among Asian American journalists. They were very helpful, very supportive. Nancy was, in fact, my first buddy at the time. She was also in the business section. She and I went out on my first assignment. Well, I found actually that the people at the LA Times were very supportive of me. I never felt racism there. I mean, maybe that makes me an exception, but I felt that people at the Times were always supportive of me. Paul Steiger was one of my first editors. I don't know if you've heard of him. He went on to be a managing editor of the Wall Street Journal, and then he was editor of ProPublica. And he was excellent. He taught me a lot about journalism. And Tom Johnson was a publisher there. And when I was one of the co-founders of AAJA, he was very supportive, always wanted to help AAJA out. I must be probably an exception because I never felt out and out racism. I'm sure there may have been a couple of incidences when people might have said to me, well, you speak good English or something, but it really wasn't common for me. I just felt a lot of support there. And eventually, more Asian American journalists joined the LA Times. I think LA was becoming ground zero at the time for the diversification of the United States, because this was 14 years after the immigration laws were changed, which allowed more Asian immigrants to come in. And LA, I think, was ground zero. There was a lot of Vietnamese coming in. Maybe not, they were coming in because the Vietnam War had ended. Some refugees were coming in, moving in Orange County. Filipinos were coming in. Chinese and Japanese Americans were already there. So I think the LA Times, among other large metro dailies, were starting to feel that they really had to hire more people of color, and they also had to serve communities of color. And I think in the case of the LA Times, too, they felt strong enough that soon after I got there, they started the MetPro program, which is still going on now. It was one of the first of its kind. It was specifically designed to train minority journalists. And in the first, I think, year or two, when the LA Times did this, they let their trainees go wherever they wanted to go. But then they decided, wait a minute, we're training all these minority journalists. We want to keep them. Why should we train them and let other people take them? So they ended up, keeping the ones that they thought were worth keeping. And after that, a lot of other papers started their own programs that were similar. And of course, at the same time, too, Bob Maynard had started the Maynard Institute up in the Bay Area. And that was one of the main centers that was training journalists of color. For me, the Asian American Journalists Association, from my perspective, started when I was still back in college. Because when I was in college at Stanford, they allowed students there to start classes for credit there. And one of the classes that I started was Asian American Media. And so one of the things that we did as part of that class was we had Bill Wong, who was at the time was at the Oakland Tribune, and Jan Yanahiro, who was a broadcast journalist. We had them come down to speak to some of our students about racism in the media. And and at that time, Bill had started a group called Asians in Mass Media. So through meeting him and through hearing his experiences, the idea occurred to me that, well, that was the kind of thing that I would want to be involved with. Well, the group, for whatever reasons, disbanded. But then when I got to the LA Times, I said, okay, well, maybe I'll try to carry on with something like that. So within, a year and a half or so after I joined the LA Times, I approached Nancy and and David and said, hey, let's think about starting an Asian American Journalists Association. And they, of course, were very receptive to it. And then soon after that, we all talked about, gee, we need to get Tritia Toyota involved because she, was an icon in LA journalism, was very well respected in the Asian American community, and was very dedicated to the community. Probably the most visible Asian American journalist in Southern California at the time. And so I said, let me go try to see if she'd be interested. I found out that she was doing a program one afternoon at the UCLA Asian American Studies Center, because I don't know if you know this, but she was very active in Asian American studies, and UCLA had one of the first Asian American studies programs in the country. So anyway, I went there and I went up to Tricia and says, hey, my name is Bill Singh. We're thinking of, an Asian American Journalists Association. Would you be interested? And her first reaction was, are you a student? And I said, no, but I work at the LA Times. And she said, of course, I'd be very interested. And she gave me her phone number and said, let's get together and talk. And that's from there, she got Frank Kwan involved. And we got Dwight Chuman because we wanted to have somebody from the ethnic media. And Dwight Chuman at the time was editor of the Rafu Shimpo, which was one of the main Japanese American community newspapers. Those were our founding six. Tricia, Frank Kwan, myself, David Kishiyama, Nancy Yoshihara, and Dwight Chuman. 40 years later, here we are.
Tell us about how the early days, how you navigated the growing
Sure.
pains.
Well, I think strategic planning in this process was very critical for AAJA getting founded and being able to survive the first few years. Because at that time, it wasn't really all that cool to be identified as a journalist of color. Not that many newsrooms yet were starting to embrace diversity. So a lot of Asian American journalists at the time were hesitant to join an organization like AAJA. So I think the first challenge that we had was to figure out, well, how can we get those people involved while at the same time be involved in pushing for fair and accurate coverage of Asian Americans and trying to eliminate stereotypes and racism in coverage, and also trying to link with the community and help the community have more links to the ability to tell their stories in the media. So it was a balancing act because a lot of Asian American journalists at that time, including some who I don't have to name but were fairly prominent, did not want to join initially. So we felt it was very important when starting out. We had to balance the advocacy and the media, mau-mauing with, trying to be a support organization to help Asian American journalists advance in their careers, to give them support and encouragement, to provide scholarships to encourage more Asian American students to get into the field. So there was a balancing act there, and I think we navigated that pretty well. And see, there were a lot of naysayers in the first few years. A lot of people said, oh, this ain't going to go very far. And we said we were going to have a scholarship dinner the first year. A lot of people were naysayers, oh, you're not going to be able to pull that off. And we just said, you can't listen to the naysayers. You're going to, we're the ones that are going to do it. We're going to go ahead. And, just through the force of our own conviction, our own visions, we pulled a lot of these things off. So we did our first scholarship dinner in the first year. We had Tom Brokaw come out, which obviously gave us a lot of credibility. Tom Bradley, who was the mayor of LA at the time, gave a welcoming address to the people. And the idea for the dinner was to raise money for scholarships, because there again, we had to do something that would be more acceptable to the community and to Asian American journalists who might have felt a little uncomfortable if we were going to raise money for really strong advocacy. So scholarships were a kind of thing that everybody could support, right? You're going to help students get into journalism. So as a result, we were able to attract people to buy tickets to the dinner, who included many non-media organizations, many businesses and community organizations and whatnot. There were still issues about were we going to take sponsorship money from tobacco companies or other non-media companies, and there was a lot of wrangling about that initially. And I think what we ended up doing was saying, okay, we can do it, but it had to be under very clear guidelines that there was no quid pro quo involved. If you were going to give us money, you cannot expect anything in return. So if you're a tobacco company, if you're Coca-Cola, if you're whoever, ExxonMobil, whatever, we'll accept your money, but it would be just like advertising in the paper. It's an advertising, but as you know, there's a wall between the business side of a newspaper or a TV station and the news side, so that just because somebody advertises doesn't mean they're going to influence the coverage. In fact, very strict. There's no ability for an advertiser to influence the coverage. So that's how we did it. So this is the same rule that applies in the places that we work. And I think that worked out fine. And people know that, they couldn't try to influence our coverage or get us to do programs that would make them look good.
I can see getting desperate for money and just saying, no, let's just take it and figure it out later. So
yeah, but that was how we did it. I mean, because there again, it makes sense because that mirrors how our employers were doing things. They took advertising, but it was very clear that there was a wall between the advertising department and the newsroom, right? Well, most newsrooms in America were lily white, very few journalists of color. There were probably a lot of people who had very strong stereotypes of people of color, and including Asian Americans. I think a lot of the coverage was either lacking of Asian Americans, or when it was done, it may have been stereotypical or condescending. I think that was about the time the model minority stereotype was probably birthed. It was kind of used as a wedge between Asian Pacific Americans and other people of color, and so I think there was still a lot of stereotyping. There was still a lot of misunderstanding and lack of exposure to Asian Americans in general, because at the time, there weren't any, champions of Dancing with the Stars who were Asian Americans. Apollo Ono. I mean, those, or Christy Yamaguchi. That was still way ahead. There weren't, very many Asian sports stars in the United States. There weren't that many Asian American actors or actresses. So there weren't very many people who people saw in the media. So there was still a lot of misunderstanding and stereotyping going on. I mean, Bruce Lee was one of the pioneers in terms of, and of course, as you know, Bruce is a hero to many people in the Asian American community because he refused to be stereotyped. And he supported a lot of other Asian American performers. And then he went on himself to show that Asian men could be portrayed in masculine ways and not in the Charlie Chan or the Fu Manchu dastardly kind of stereotype. I mean, he could show that an Asian American or an Asian male could be seen as a role model and someone people could look up to. He's buried a few hundred yards from my parents are buried up in Seattle, but the Wing Luke Museum up in Seattle had several commemorations and exhibits celebrating his legacy. And that was also very important to me because my parents were actively involved in the Chinese American community in Seattle, and so they encouraged me, everything I wanted to do to be active in the Asian American community, they were very encouraging. They fully supported my involvement in AAJA. In fact, my dad tried to come to some of the conventions, and he was always cutting out my articles and sharing them with people. Some of my relatives probably got tired of him sending them copies of my articles in the Times.
Tell me about some of your favorite AAJA moments.
Well, obviously, the first time I met Tritia was a favorite moment. She's a lifetime friend. I mean, she's not active in AAJA now, as you know, but that was a highlight. Our first scholarship dinner was a huge highlight. I remember standing in the room thinking, wow, we've made it. We did it. We actually got people to come to this thing. And we raised $18,000. Forming chapters was huge. First of all, obviously, we had to establish AAJA in LA first and show that it could work. And through that, another highlight was all the people in helping the AAJA LA chapter become established, and all the friendships and the camaraderie among those people, starting with Yet Locke, rest in peace, people like Elaine Wu, Cindy Chow Snavely, Lorena Tong, Cherry G. Once we were able to establish and prove that AAJA could survive and be strong as a chapter in one city, then it was time to start developing chapters elsewhere. And also we had gotten funding at that time from the Gannett Foundation so that we could hire an executive director, and that was a major step toward being able to go national. Keep in mind at the time, this was before social media, this was before the internet. It was not that easy to find out who was around in other cities. You couldn't go on Facebook or on Twitter, or you couldn't just, get online and search San Francisco Chronicle, who are the Asian-looking names. So it took a while to figure out who was who in different cities. Now it's so easy to do that, but it was not that easy back then. I was the main person going out and trying to get people to start chapters in other cities. We went to San Francisco, and Wendy Tokuda was there. Jan Yanahiro, who I had met at Stanford, was there. Bill Wong was there. Sacramento, people like Sandra Jin was there. Seattle, Lori Matsukawa, my college buddy from the Stanford Asian American newspaper. Frank Abe in Seattle. And went to Hawaii, and I met Sandra Oshiro, was very kind and let me stay. That was the first time I'd ever gone to Hawaii. And she let me stay at her house, and in her living room they hosted the first meeting of people in Hawaii. And then the big step was going back east, because we figured if we can go back east and get it going and back east. So we went to New York. Jeannie Park was wonderful. Jeannie Park's one of my heroes. I mean, what she's done in her career is amazing. And I really look up to her. Mimi Chan in Washington, D.C. And once we got New York and Washington, D.C. set, then we were in good shape. But see, what was really cool about starting chapters in other cities was that it would give those people a chance to lead. And, most journalists usually are not involved in leadership positions in organizations outside of maybe being an editor in a newsroom. And leading an organization, a volunteer organization, is a lot different than being, say, an editor or a news director, because they're your employees. I mean, you're paying them to work for you, so you could tell them what to do. In a volunteer organization, if you're not a good leader, sorry, I'm not interested. So it was a great chance for people to develop leadership skills, and it was really exhilarating to see that. And some of these people were just tremendous leaders. In fact, that's another highlight too. Okay, the ability, to pass the baton on to the next round of leaders. It was critical for us. When I was going to step down, and I put in, from 1981 to 1987, the first convention. I was stepping down. And to be able to have someone like Lloyd and Diane Wong, who was the second executive director, to take the baton and run with it was critical, and that was huge. Because when an organization starts, to be able to pass the leadership to the next people, whether it's a business or a community organization or nonprofit, it's critical, right? You have to be able to pass on leadership. So that was a highlight too. And then of course the first national convention, which David Kishiyama was the chair of. I mean, we knew we had arrived when we got all these people in the room, and for many of the people there, that was the first time they had seen so many Asian American journalists, and it was like exhilarating for them. And people were just, wow. And the fact that we could have done something like that. And remember, there were naysayers saying too, oh, you can't do a national convention, blah, blah, blah. So that was a highlight too, and I remember it was just so exhilarating to see all these people there and have a really good program, and starting fun things like Journalistic Jeopardy, which ended up later becoming Trivia Bowl. A lot of things that ended up being carried on eventually throughout the 40-year history of the organization. I mean, we weren't sure how many people would come, obviously, but I think also at the same time you saw the fact that in chapters people were really enthusiastic in the chapters. It was a good harbinger for the first convention to be successful. We got a lot of support from the community, and Gannett was there helping us out with funding for that too. Now by 1987, there was more efforts within the newspaper and television industries to start doing more diversity stuff. So we were finding more support for that too. And pretty much it worked out. We've been able to do conventions pretty much every year. I don't think we've missed a year. We were really dedicated to this. This was something that was so much in my heart and something I really felt strongly in. In fact, as you may have heard at the Founders Forum, I said that I felt it was actually more risky not to be doing these things. Just to, just give you some perspective on me, AAJA for me was not my first rodeo in being active in the Asian American community. And I was involved in other community organizations too. So I just felt very compelled that these things had to be done. So never at any point did it feel like it was, it was too overwhelming. And I'm not saying that I was great at all of those things either. I mean, there was a learning curve in all of this. But it took a team. This AAJ from day one had always been a team sport. And without people like Yet Locke and with Karen Saraguchi, our first executive director, Cindy Chow Snavely, with people like Tritia and Frank and Nancy and David and Dwight and other people, none of these things could have happened. I think given that people were becoming very receptive, I think it all came together.
Since then, what you felt has changed in the media landscape in relation to AAPI issues and staffers in the newsroom?
Well, there are a lot more AAPI staffers now, at least in bigger city metros. I'm pretty sure there are in the bigger city radio and TV as well. And there's a lot of people that are blogging and doing other types of media as well. So while certainly there needs to be more diversity, I think we've made a lot of progress in that regard. There is a lot more visibility of Asian Americans in the media, not just in journalism, but in entertainment and somewhat in politics, and certainly in other fields like the sciences and education and so forth. But still, there's a lot more that has to be done. And I think that the thing that's different now that strikes me that wasn't 40 years ago is the fact that now the media industries have changed dramatically in that there are existential challenges to the media industries that didn't exist 40 years ago. For example, 40 years ago, before the internet, if you wanted to catch up on the news, what were your choices? Your newspaper or your TV station or your radio station? And so, like a newspaper was like a town hall and a town center. And the advent of the internet and social media has totally changed all that, where now there are very existential threats to journalism as it currently exists. At least the way I see it, a lot of news coverage now has been commoditized. It's very easy to find news in so many different sources. Bloggers, Facebook takes a lot of stuff and repackages it and puts it on their site and sells ads against it. There's so much you can get various websites. There's the changing of the fairness doctrine has totally transformed the television industry, where as before, if you were going to put out television news, you had to have balanced coverage. You had to be able to have, if you were going to do liberal perspectives, you had to have conservative perspectives too. Okay, when they eliminated the fairness doctrine, that totally changed the television industry. So now you could have Fox News on the right, MSNBC on the left. You could have everything in between. You could have people now in the media who are talk show hosts on both the extreme right and the extreme left. And so now you've created more polarization in the media. All this stuff didn't exist 40 years ago. And so now you have a crisis in news media about, who do you believe? I would call it the misinformation age. What is reliable? What's factual? What's the truth? Who's telling you the truth, right? And there again, people also can get a lot of the information for free, whereas they couldn't before. So now the challenge is, how do you distinguish journalism from things that are, I would say, fake news? How do you distinguish? Because as you know, a lot of people think a lot of journalism is fake news, right? So these things all did not exist. Now, granted, 40 years ago, you could have said fake news was how journalists were covering Asian Americans, but that's different. And I think now that creates whole new challenges. For me, that means that AAJA should be a catalyst for reinventing journalism so that it becomes more of a solutions-oriented business. You know, as you probably know or realize, most of coverage now covers symptoms of problems. You know, like anti-Asian hate. Okay, you cover attacks on Asian Americans. So that's a symptom of racism against Asian Americans. Most coverage, symptoms coverage, though, has been commoditized. That's the kind of coverage that's been commoditized because anybody can do that kind of thing. You know, this collapse of the condo in Miami. There's so many different ways you could hear about and see that. You don't have to pay for it. You can go online on YouTube and see plenty of stuff about the collapse of that condo. You can get plenty of news about COVID and about the Delta variant. You get plenty of news about Asian American violence, anti-Asian violence. So I think the need is to elevate journalism to a higher standard. And I think if you go toward focusing more on covering causes and solutions of problems, and when I talk about problems, I mean anti-Asian violence or climate change or income inequality or education or healthcare, then you've elevated your coverage and now you can distinguish it more from a lot of the lower level information that's out there, because to cover solutions requires a lot more sophistication, it's more value added, and it requires a lot higher level of skill of journalists. And I think journalists need to step their game up. Okay, you've got to put a product out there that is clearly distinguished, okay, that people will be willing to do. And interestingly, they're starting to do surveys of this now that show that actually solutions journalism actually is more receptive. People are actually responding to it. You know, because a lot of people are getting tired of just symptoms journalism, because symptoms journalism, as you can probably imagine, is mostly bad news. You know, anti-Asian violence was mostly bad news. You know, the condo collapse is bad news. So at a certain point, people only have so much bad news they can take, and they turn off from it. And that's partly, I think, why viewership and readership may have been declining. And you know, because people at some point kind of get tired of bad news. They want something that's more uplifting. So they're actually doing surveys. There's something called the Solution Journalism Network that did a survey with a media research firm called Smith Geiger that actually showed that people respond more receptively to solutions coverage because it's uplifting. It gives people hope. Like, for example, if you're covering climate change and you can show people solutions that they can get involved with, you could do that yourself. And also the other thing too is that solution journalism actually is a way of raising more money to support, you know, because you know there's more news deserts happening in those cities that are losing their newspapers and TV stations. And I think if journalists start doing solutions coverage, they will find that they will get more support from philanthropic organizations as well as the government. There was a proposal in the infrastructure bill to actually provide support for journalism. And a lot of small communities are losing their newspaper.
I'll give you a minute to give me your final thoughts on how you feel about the 40th anniversary of AAJA.
Well, first of all, it's exhilarating that the fact that the organization has come for 40 years, because most businesses, most organizations don't last that long. 40 years is a long time. So hats off to AAJA. And look, you know, you have global membership, you have, 1,800 members. People, AAJA family, people are so dedicated to the organization. So that's really exhilarating. It's great to see that. But I think AAJA needs to step up to the challenges of today. The things that we started AAJA with 40 years ago are not enough now. You got to go to the next level. You know, that's just one idea, AAJA 2.0. But people can come up with other ideas too. I'm not saying you have to follow this one, but you've got to raise your game, because the challenges facing the news media are not just about diversity and inclusion anymore. I mean, how can you know, what good is more diversity and more inclusion in newsrooms that are shrinking? You know, if you're losing jobs, you know, what good is having more diversity in a shrinking newsroom? You've got to be able to grow the industry. Go back to the days of Watergate when journalism was held in very high regard, when people, you know, Woodward and Bernstein, when journalism was held in very high esteem. Go to the point where journalism is seen as a critical component of a democratic society, where you can rely on journalism to help solve problems like racism and climate change and education, healthcare. And I think journalists should step up to that. The country, the world needs that.